The snow had just started falling when I buried my son's childhood dog in the backyard. I know that sounds like an odd place to begin, but that Tuesday morning in February, standing at the kitchen window watching the snow cover the small mound of dirt near the oak tree, I understood for the first time that some things you love simply leave without asking permission. My wife Eleanor had left the same way, quietly, on a Wednesday, while I was downstairs making her chamomile tea. She had been sick for 14 months. Pancreatic cancer moves fast, and it doesn't negotiate. The doctors gave her 8 months, and she gave them 6 more just out of stubbornness, which was the most Eleanor thing she could have done. She spent those extra months finishing her garden, writing letters to people she loved, and making sure our grandson Oliver had enough stories about her to carry him well into adulthood. She was 61 years old. She had the laugh of a woman half her age, and the wisdom of someone twice it. I am Robert. I am 67. I spent 32 years building a civil engineering firm from a drafting table in our garage to a company with 43 employees and contracts across 4 states. I did not build it alone. Eleanor kept the books for the first 9 years before we could afford a real accountant. My son Nathan grew up watching me work 16-hour days. I always thought that meant something. I thought watching a father pour everything into something honest and hard-earned would leave a mark on a child. A good mark. I was wrong about that. Or maybe I was right, and someone else left a different kind of mark first. Nathan married Diane 8 years ago. I will tell you what I saw at the wedding because I think it matters. I saw a woman who scanned the room before she smiled, who calculated before she laughed, who asked me within the first hour of meeting me not what I did, but what the company was worth. I told Eleanor that night in our hotel room, and she told me I was being uncharitable. She was probably right. She usually was. But I noticed things over those 8 years. Small things at first. Diane stopped inviting us to their home for the holidays after the 2nd year. She always had a reason. Renovations, a trip, her family visiting from out of town. Eleanor accepted every excuse with grace, because Eleanor believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt. I accepted them because I did not want to make Nathan choose. Then Oliver was born. He came into the world 7 years ago, loud and red-faced and perfect. Eleanor cried for 20 minutes in the hospital hallway. I held him in the delivery room and he grabbed my finger and something cracked open in my chest that I still cannot fully describe. I drove home that night going 10 miles under the speed limit because the world suddenly felt very fragile and very precious. Oliver changed things for a while. Diane was warmer when she needed us for childcare. Nathan seemed happier. We spent 2 good years where Sunday dinners happened again, and the house felt like what I had always hoped a family felt like. Then Eleanor got sick, and everything shifted in a way that I did not fully understand until much later. Nathan started coming by the house alone, not to check on Eleanor, though he would visit her for a few minutes upstairs. Mostly he sat at the kitchen table and talked about the company, about my retirement plan, about what the transition of ownership would look like. I told him I wasn't planning to retire yet. Eleanor was sick, but she wanted me to keep working. She said it was the thing keeping me from falling apart, and she was right about that too. Nathan nodded and said he understood. Then he came back 2 weeks later with the same questions, wearing different clothes. After Eleanor passed, I gave myself 1 month of just breathing. I went through her things slowly, the way she would have wanted. I kept her garden alive through the end of summer, even though I killed 2 of the rose bushes and had to quietly replace them before anyone noticed. I took Oliver to the park every Saturday because Diane said she needed the time, and Nathan said he was busy with work, and honestly, sitting on that park bench watching a 6-year-old on the swings was the only hour of any week that didn't feel like I was walking on the bottom of a lake. In September, Nathan asked if we could have a family meeting about the business. I said of course. I thought he meant the 2 of us. He showed up with Diane. She sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Eleanor and I had eaten 30 years of breakfasts, and she placed a manila folder in front of her, like she was chairing a corporate meeting. She was wearing a blazer. At 6 in the evening, in my kitchen, Nathan looked at the table. Diane looked at me. She said, "Robert, now that Eleanor is gone, we think it's time to have an honest conversation about what comes next." I said I was listening. She opened the folder. There were papers inside. She slid them toward me. Transfer of ownership documents, the company, the building, the property it sat on. Everything moved into Nathan's name, effective immediately. A small monthly stipend for me, enough to cover groceries and utilities, and not much else. I looked at my son. He was studying something very interesting on the surface of the table. I asked him if this was what he wanted. He said, "Dad, it's just practical. You're 67. Eleanor is gone. You shouldn't have to carry all this anymore." I said, "I didn't ask if it was practical. I asked if it's what you want." He didn't answer. Diane answered for him. She said, "What Nathan wants is for this family to move forward. And we can't do that if you're holding on to something that was always going to pass to him eventually." She smiled then. It was the kind of smile that doesn't reach anywhere near the eyes. Eleanor would have understood that. She used my wife's name like a key, like she knew exactly which lock it opened. I closed the folder. I pushed it back across the table. I said I needed time to think about it, and I would be in touch. Diane's smile didn't move, but something behind her eyes did. She picked up the folder and told me not to take too long. After they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. I did not fall apart. I want to be clear about that. I had fallen apart already, when Eleanor died, in the privacy of our bedroom, and I had quietly put myself back together because I had a grandson who needed someone steady and a company where 43 people showed up every morning trusting that something solid was waiting for them. What I felt sitting in that kitchen was not grief. It was clarity. I called my attorney the next morning. His name is James, and I have known him for 22 years. He has a voice like a man who has heard everything and is still not surprised. I told him what happened. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Don't sign anything. Don't move anything. Don't tell them what you're thinking. Come see me Thursday." I went to see James on Thursday. What he told me took about 2 hours, and I will condense it here. The company was structured as an LLC with me as the sole managing member. Eleanor had been a silent partner. When she passed, her share transferred to me automatically per our original operating agreement, which Diane apparently did not know or did not believe. I owned 100%. Nathan owned nothing unless I gave it to him. James also said something else. He said he had received a phone call the previous month from a business attorney he didn't recognize, asking hypothetical questions about contested competency claims and how quickly a family could petition for guardianship over an aging business owner. The call had been logged. The attorney had given a fake firm name. James had noted the number. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked James what I should do. He said, "Robert, I think you already know what to do. I think you came here because you wanted someone to tell you you're not crazy for thinking it." He was right. I did know. I went home and I did something I had never done before in my life. I ordered a small digital recorder online. I placed it in the kitchen on the shelf behind the cookbooks, behind Eleanor's copy of The Joy of Cooking that still had her handwriting in the margins. And I waited. I did not have to wait long. Nathan came by 4 days later. Diane was not with him. He sat down and he looked tired and younger than his age, the way people look when they are doing something that doesn't sit right in their chest. He said, "Dad, she's not wrong about the timeline. The company needs clear succession or it's going to affect the contracts." I said, "Tell me something, Nathan. Is this coming from you or from her?" He rubbed the back of his neck. He said, "Does it matter?" I said it mattered to me. He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "She told me that if we don't get this settled, she's going to talk to a doctor about having you evaluated. She says your grief is affecting your judgment." He stopped. He couldn't quite look at me. I told her you were fine. She said she'd handle it herself if I didn't. I asked him if he believed I was not fine. He said, "No, Dad. I think you're the sharpest person I know." He pressed his palms flat on the table. "I just don't know what to do about her." I told him I appreciated his honesty. I meant it. Nathan is not a bad man. He is a man who made a choice about who to stand next to, and has been living inside that choice long enough that he's forgotten there was ever a door. 2 weeks later, Diane called and said she had made an appointment for me with a neurologist. She said it was out of concern. She said the family had noticed some changes. I asked her which family members specifically, and she said Nathan and herself. I told her I would think about it. I called James. James called her back and informed her that any attempt to initiate guardianship proceedings without medical evidence would be challenged immediately and expensively. There was a long silence after that. The company has a board, 4 members including myself. I had appointed the other 3, and I trusted all of them. I called a board meeting, and I did not tell Nathan or Diane. I informed the board of what had been happening. I showed them the transfer documents Diane had prepared. I played them 4 minutes of audio from the recording in my kitchen. Diane's voice, very clear, discussing managing the old man and getting the signature before he lawyers up. Margaret, who has been on my board for 11 years and has the disposition of a federal judge, said, "Robert, what would you like us to do?" I told her. The following Saturday, I called Nathan and Diane and said I was ready to discuss the transfer. I asked them to come to the office on Monday. I said I would have documents prepared. I want to tell you what I was feeling that Sunday night because I think it is important. I was not angry. I had moved past anger somewhere in those weeks between the kitchen conversation and the board meeting. What I felt was something closer to sorrow. For Nathan, for the version of my son who had once shown me a finger painting of our house and told me it was the best place in the world. For whatever happened to that boy along the way. I also thought about Oliver. Oliver had been living in a home full of tension and strategy and adult calculations that a 7-year-old should never have to absorb. He had been brought to my house only when it was convenient, which meant less and less. The last time I saw him, 3 weeks before, he had sat very quietly next to me on the couch, and after a long time he said, "Grandpa, are you and my dad fighting?" I told him no. I told him everything was going to be fine. I decided that night that whatever happened in that boardroom on Monday was not just about the company. It was about making sure Oliver had one person in his life whose foundation did not shift based on what was being negotiated. Monday morning, I arrived early. James was there. Margaret was there. The other 2 board members. Our company's corporate attorney, who is named Patricia, and who I have never once seen uncertain about anything. Nathan and Diane arrived at 9. Diane was in another blazer. She had a different folder. She set it on the conference table with the confidence of someone who believes they have already won. She looked at the number of people in the room and her smile flickered, just for a second. Nathan looked at me. I nodded at him, just slightly. I hope he understood what I meant by it. I meant, I see you. I meant, this is not about you if you don't want it to be. Diane opened her folder. She began explaining the transfer documents. She talked for about 90 seconds. Patricia held up one hand and stopped her. She said, "Before we proceed, there are several items the board needs to address." She opened her own folder, which was considerably thicker. First, we have documentation of an unauthorized inquiry made to an outside attorney regarding competency proceedings against the managing member, Robert. Second, we have an audio recording made in Robert's private residence in which a plan to obtain his signature under duress was discussed. Third, we have a letter from Robert's neurologist, whom he saw voluntarily last week, confirming that he has no cognitive impairment of any kind. She looked at Diane without any particular expression. "Would you like to continue?" Diane looked at her folder. The room was very quiet. She looked at Nathan. Nathan said nothing. I had asked James to prepare a counter document. Not the transfer Diane wanted. A restructured ownership agreement that placed the company into a family trust managed by me for as long as I chose, with clear succession protocols that the board approved, with Nathan able to earn a meaningful role through demonstrated work and merit, rather than inheritance by pressure. The trust also created an education fund for Oliver, guaranteed regardless of what happened between any of the adults in the room. That was the part I cared about most. I slid the documents to Nathan, not to Diane. I said, "This is what I'm prepared to offer. The company is protected. Your future is in it if you want it. Oliver is taken care of no matter what." Nathan looked at the papers for a long time. Diane said, "You can't do this." "We have," Patricia said. "You have nothing legally actionable. I'd recommend reading what's in front of you before saying anything further." Diane stood up. She took her folder. She looked at me with an expression I had never received from another person in my life, pure, cold contempt, the kind that doesn't bother to disguise itself anymore because it has decided the performance is over. She said, "You'll regret this." I said, Diane, I have buried my wife. I have rebuilt myself from the ground up more times than I can count. I've had people tell me a project was impossible and then watched it get built. I paused. I don't think you understand who you were trying to move. She left. Her heels were very loud in the hallway, and then they weren't. Nathan stayed. He sat at that conference table for a long time after everyone else had stepped out to give us privacy. He had the documents in front of him, and he was looking at them the way you look at something when you're trying to figure out if it's real. He said, I'm sorry, Dad. I said, I know. He said, I kept telling myself I'd fix it, that I'd find a way to slow her down, but I kept not doing it. I said, Nathan, look at me. He did. You are my son. That is not something that changes based on what happened in this room, but I need you to decide who you are going to be now. I can't make that decision, and neither can she. It's yours. He nodded. His eyes were wet. He looked, for a moment, very much like the boy with the finger painting. He signed the documents. I want to tell you what happened next because this is the part that matters most to me, more than the business, more than the legal proceedings that followed when Diane retained her own attorney and discovered that Patricia had been right about her having nothing actionable. 3 days after the board meeting, I called Nathan and asked if I could take Oliver to the Science Museum. He said yes. He said Oliver had been asking for me. I picked Oliver up on a Saturday morning. He ran down the front porch steps and crashed into my legs the way 7-year-olds do when they have been holding something in and finally see a safe place to let it out. I held on to the top of his head and I breathed. In the car, he asked me if I was okay. He has Eleanor's way of asking that direct, no preamble, looking right at you. I told him I was better than okay. I told him his grandmother would have found the whole situation very instructive. He thought about this. Then he said, What does instructive mean? I told him it meant it taught you something important. He nodded like that made sense. Then he said, What did it teach you? I drove for a while before I answered. I said, It taught me that the things you build, the real ones, the ones that last, you can't build them out of fear or out of pressure. You build them slowly, with people you actually trust. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror. He was watching me carefully. And you protect the people who can't protect themselves yet? He thought about that for a moment. Then he said, Like me? I said, Especially like you. He went back to looking out the window, apparently satisfied with this answer. Kids have a way of accepting truth when you give it to them plainly. They haven't learned yet to be suspicious of simplicity. We spent 4 hours at the Science Museum. We looked at dinosaur bones and an exhibit about deep space and a hands-on electricity display that Oliver refused to leave for 35 minutes. I bought him a small telescope in the gift shop. Eleanor had always said he had her eyes for detail. I think she was right. On the way home, he fell asleep in the back seat. I drove slowly, the same way I had driven home from the hospital the night he was born. The world still felt fragile and precious. But it also felt, for the first time since February, like something I could stand on. I will not pretend the rest was simple. Diane and Nathan separated 4 months later. That was not something I caused, and not something I was glad about whatever I thought of. Diane, the fracture of a family is not a victory. It is only a loss, with a different shape. Nathan moved into an apartment 20 minutes away. He started showing up at the office 2 days a week. He is learning, slowly, the things I tried to show him by example for 30 years. Some lessons take longer through example than they do through experience. I am trying to be patient. The guardianship inquiry was referred to the state bar for investigation. I will leave it at that. The company had its best quarter in 6 years this past fall. Margaret says it's because stable leadership creates stable culture. I think she's right. I also think it's because 43 people came to work every day knowing the floor wasn't going to be pulled out from under them. And people do their best work when they're not afraid of falling. I have Oliver every Saturday now. We have been through the Science Museum twice more, and we have started a project in the backyard, building a small greenhouse. Oliver draws the plans. I do the construction. He is a very exacting project manager for someone who just lost his second front tooth. Last Saturday, he looked at the frame we had built, and then he looked at me and said, "Grandpa, this looks like it's going to last." I said, "That's the idea." He nodded, very serious, and went back to his measuring tape. I thought about Eleanor then. I thought about her handwriting in the margins of her cookbook. I thought about the letters she wrote before she died, one of which was addressed to Oliver and sealed, and which I am keeping until he is old enough to read it without losing too much of it to the age he is. She always knew which things were for which season. I thought about what it means to be a man at 67 who has lost the person who made sense of everything, and who has been pushed and maneuvered and underestimated, and who is still standing in his backyard on a Saturday morning, watching his grandson measure a greenhouse wall with total concentration and complete faith that the numbers will add up. They do add up. That is the thing about doing the work honestly. The numbers add up. Maybe not on the timeline someone else has planned for you. Maybe not in the shape you were expecting. But they add up. I do not know what Eleanor would say about all of it. She was always better than me at finding the exact right words for complicated things. But I know what she would do. She would make tea. She would sit at the kitchen table. She would look at whoever needed looking at, and she would wait until they were ready to be honest. I try to do that now. I try to hold still and wait and let people come to the honest thing in their own time. Oliver finished measuring. He looked up at me with Eleanor's eyes and said, "Okay, Grandpa, I think we're ready for the roof." I picked up my tools. We gotta work.